Well, I want to start this lecture out by discussing world population, because population and the results of that population affect the environment extensively. So let's take a look at a graph of world population growth over the last 50 or 60 years, since about 1950. And you can see, the first thing that jumps out at you, I think, is that you can see that the world population has been increasing dramatically and will, it looks like, continue to decrease well into this century. We are at 2016 with 7.4 billion people on the planet. That's an immense number, but the good news is that almost all the predictions prior to 2016 indicated that we would have many more people on the planet than the 7.4 billion. So it has been remarkable what the world has been able to accomplish in the last 40 or 50 years in terms of decreasing the birth rate, which I'll get into in just a minute. Now, there is some computer modeling done on here. That purple line that you see, that is the beginning of the modeling starting back around 2013 or so. And it projects into the future what the world population will be. And I think, as you can see, there's quite a large variation on what we anticipate the world population to be. It could continue to increase even faster than it is today if we don't get some handle on the birth rates and, well, birth rates in general. And it can decrease. In fact, if we start decreasing fertility rates, we could start to see a downward trend in world population by 2050. Nobody knows right now which way we're going. Of course, the more people on the planet, the more environmental degradation there's going to be. So we're unclear as to what world population is going to do in the future. It could be declining by 2050 if we continue to reduce the fertility rate. But no one knows for sure. Now, there's several other things that we can see on this diagram. One of those things is that you may notice in the industrialized nations like Europe, the United States, Canada, that is in general North America, Australia, we see pretty much a level of population, and it's predicted to be level into the future for those countries. This is typical of industrialized countries, and it has to do a lot with people choosing, women in particular, choosing not to have many children. And it has good and bad impacts, and we'll talk about that in the future. Asia has gotten a hold of its incredible population increase. The two most populous countries in the world, China and India, looked back 40 years ago, looked like the populations in those countries would be so large that we might not be able to feed them. But because of legislation in China, which keeps a couple from only having one child, and then also with India, through education and through programs that distribute ways to prevent pregnancy, we have seen a decline in their fertility rates, such that the increase in population in Asia has started to not decline, but it started to head over towards something that looks like a peak in the future, depending, of course, on which one of those graphs, or I should say which one of the models we fall into. Of course, nobody knows, but in Asia the population could decrease sometime in the next 20 or 30 years. Africa is problematic, as we'll see in many respects. Africa has some serious problems in terms of politics, medicine, poverty, and so on and so forth. And their population no matter which model you use, looks to continue to an increase. And that's bad news, because it's a country that's already, or I should say a continent that's already in great poverty. And I think Africa needs a lot of help to overcome some of the problems there. We'll get more into Africa in a minute. Well, let's talk about this next graph, which is a graph of the yearly growth rate percent. Technically, it's kind of births minus deaths. It's a little more complicated than that. I won't get into it. But in 2016, we are looking at a fertility rate of 1.13%. And so that's suggestive then, on this graph you can see it very clearly, that we have had a decrease in the growth rate, the yearly growth rate. So that we're in a position now to say that as long as we have a decrease in the growth rate, eventually world population will start to decrease. One of the reasons that we're seeing world population increase, even though since the late 1960s we've had a decrease in the growth rate, is because the industrialized nations have had decreasing fertility rates, but they have had their economies have allowed medicine to, advance, and that advancement in medicine then has led to an extension of life expectancy. And of course that life expectancy has been carried on into other countries also. As a result, people are living longer, and so even though fertility rates and growth rates are declining, we still have this situation where world population is increasing. Just to be more specific about this growth rate, it's births minus deaths divided by the total population over the specific period. In this case, it's yearly. So let's go on now to a map of the fertility rates worldwide, and the color variations are due to the number of children per woman. So if you had a country falling in the yellow there, for example, 3 to 4, that means that on average a woman in that country would have somewhere between 3 and 4 children. Well, there's some things that really stand out on the graph. First of all, once again, the industrialized nations, or what we refer to as the industrialized nations, like the United States, like Western Europe, China, Australia, they have fertility rates that are lower than 2. Now, an important thing that we'll talk about is that if you want to replace your population, that is, if you want to just keep it steady, not growing, not decreasing, then you're going to need a birth rate of about 2.1. So on this graph, anything under 2 means that you've got a declining declining birth rate. That is, you are not reproducing your population. You're creating in the future a growth rate that will decline. And in all those countries with blue there, Brazil, Chile, as I mentioned, Europe, Australia, all of those are countries that should eventually see their populations decrease. The reason that we're still seeing world population once again increasing is because even in these countries the life expectancy is increasing, so people aren't dying as fast as they used to, which is good news, longer lives, and as a consequence then world population is increasing. There are some problematic areas, but there is also promise on this graph. Look at India. They have gotten below 3. China gotten below 2. Brazil, place with a lot of population. Mexico, South America in general, all below 3. These are Catholic countries, so abortion's out, birth control is not allowed by the Catholic Church, and yet when we educate in those countries, when we give women the option to choose they tend to choose for not having many children. And so we're seeing then declines in fertility rates in those countries. Not trying to pick on the Catholic Church at all, just trying to point out that these are typically Catholic countries where we would expect a large population increase. That's the way it has been in the past, but they are still getting to the point where they can't even reproduce their own population. So good news there because we don't have massive starvation from too much overpopulation. Well, Afghanistan, they're in the red, and the countries in Central Africa and Southern Africa even are problematic. And we see that fertility rates continue to be quite high and even astronomically high. Look at those purple countries. They having 6, 7 children per woman. And that could be devastating in the future in terms of being able to feed a population that is increasing like that. And I'll tell you, what's bad about it is that this is happening in the most poor, or I should say the poorest countries on the planet. And so we need to take notice. They have very, very poor medical care. And I think one way, and I'll talk more about this, is that we need to get Africa more involved in world trade. Free trade has clearly impacted the world. We're seeing the standard of living increased because of free world trade. We're seeing the average income of all people on the planet increasing. Those trade barriers are coming down, and we're then seeing a positive impact. We can feed a population that we thought previously we might not be able to feed. So things are looking up for the world. That's the good news. The bad news is that we still have some areas to worry about, and one of them, a big concern, is Africa. Now, I want to mention here the carrying capacity of the Earth. The carrying capacity of the Earth is how many people the Earth can support. No one knows the answer to this. We used to think it was much lower. We used to worry that 7.4 billion people couldn't possibly be dealt with. Back in the 80s and 90s, I remember very vividly people saying that we were going to be around 8 billion people, and there was no way we were going to be able to feed 8 billion people on this planet. But since that time, we've learned that yes, we can support 7.4 billion people without massive starvation. But if you increase world population, there is always the danger that you're going to, at some point, not be able to feed that world population, and people are going to starve to death. And I'm not talking about small starvation, I'm talking about massive starvation. So we have to be concerned then about the carrying capacity of the world. I must emphasize, though, no one knows what the carrying capacity is. The technology has been incredible. It has worked in our favor now for a long time, and hopefully it will work in our favor in the future. If we can keep producing more crops in better ways, then we can support the world populations that are predicted in the future. The problem, of course, gets back to the environment and the tremendous environmental degradation that's taking place because of the increase in world population. You've got to clear more land and grow more to feed that population. So it is problematic in general. Let me give you some numbers here. It is anticipated or estimated that by 2035 we'll have 8.4 billion people on the planet, about 1 billion more than we have right now. And then by 2055 we could peak at a population of about 9.6. There is hope that we will peak under 10 billion. 10 billion seems to be maybe getting close to our carrying capacity on the planet, and certainly getting close to something that could lead to some serious environmental problems. I also want to emphasize, I mentioned it before, but I want to emphasize this replacement fertility number or rate. That is 2.1, so keep that in mind when we start talking about fertility. If every woman has an average of 2.1 children on the planet, then we will remain level population-wise as long as people die at a constant rate. That is, as long as we don't see an increase in the life expectancy. But as we'll see here in a minute, life expectancy has been increasing, and so as a consequence we can anticipate world population increasing. So it's a sort of a double-edged sword. We can decrease fertility, but we're seeing increase in life expectancy that working kind of against each other, and the result is that increase in world population. And we expect to continue to see a fertility decrease, but we will see also probably countries increasing their life expectancy. And therefore we don't know where this world population is going to end up. Well, this is a graph of the infant mortality rates in the world. It is the number of infant deaths per 1,000, children under 1 dying per 1,000. And the good news is that the industrialized nations, including the United States, of course, and China, most all of South America, Australia, all of those countries, some parts of Asia are having rather low fertility rates in the green there, less than 20 infants dying per 1,000. I would point out that the United States has a rather high infant mortality rate compared to Canada and Western Europe and Australia. So we may want to look at what they're doing medically in those countries, because we spend more money here in the United States than any other country per person on medicine. So of course an obvious question then is, why isn't the United States infant mortality rate lower? That needs to be, I think, addressed. Well, it gets pretty scary though in some countries. Look at the countries again in Africa, look at Afghanistan. These are areas where they're having devastating poverty and an impact on how many children live at birth. One of the reasons why we may be seeing high fertility rates in these countries is because the life expectancy of young children is so low. Well, let me give you some numbers. In the United States, we have an infant mortality rate of 6. It's not very good when you compare it to Western Europe, but still very good compared to other countries. Compare that to Afghanistan with 115. Of course, Afghanistan has had wars going on for what seems like centuries, certainly for decades. Japan is number 1 in the world. They have an infant mortality rate of 2. So I would think it would be a goal of the United States to certainly equal Japan. They've done remarkable things in Japan. That little island has millions of people on it, and yet they have tremendous medical facilities, and infant mortality rate is very low. China has come along quite well. They used to have extremely high infant mortality rates. They currently have a 12. That's a little too high. You'd like to see that come down. But that's all good news compared to countries like Sierra Leone. Sierra Leone in West Africa, and it's not the worst country, but it has an infant mortality rate of 72. So that's 72 children per 1,000 dying. That's really unacceptable. The world needs to take note of that, I think, and do something about that. People are dying. I've been to Sierra Leone. It's massive poverty. I've worked there, and all I can tell you is that I think we need to find out a way to help these people. Getting them part of the World Trade Organization in better ways might be a possible answer. I don't know. This is a graph of life expectancy. Whenever you talk about world population growth, you need to talk about life expectancy, because one of the things that we have been seeing since the 1950s and before is that life expectancy has been increasing. Look back at the 1950s in places well, let's just take the world for example. The life expectancy of the world was around 46, 47, and now life expectancy in the world is somewhere around the high 60s, age of 60. So anywhere in the world, if you're being born today, your life expectancy is going to be, on average, compared to everybody else in the world, about 60. But of course it's problematic in certain areas. The more developed regions in the red there, those are regions which have extensively high life expectancy rates. Note that back in the 1950s you could expect to live to be 67 or so in that period in countries like the United States. Today we've gotten that number up into the low 80s, 84, 83, somewhere around there. So life expectancy in the more developed countries is very good, but then look at a place like Africa. Back in the 50s, you could anticipate them being born and dying at the age of 40 on average. It's gone up. That's good news. It's up into the high 60s now, but it's still too low, and it's much lower in countries where there's extreme poverty, as you'll see from some of the numbers I give you. In the United States, we have a life expectancy on average of about 79. Compare that to the other Western, or I should say the industrialized nations like Western Europe, and that's relatively low. Japan has a life expectancy of 84. That's #1 in the world. So we should anticipate, given the amount of money we're spending on medicine, we would anticipate certainly equaling Japan in terms of life expectancy, but we're 5 or 6 years below Japan. That's kind of meaningful. I think people at that age can be productive and be good citizens. So we probably need to improve those numbers here in the United States. We rank 34th in the world with a 79 life expectancy number. It's increasing. Don't get me wrong there, but and if you're being born today, who knows what the life expectancy will be if you live to be older. Here's some scary numbers. Afghanistan is 164th in the world, and yet their life expectancy is 61. Wars are certainly a part of that. But take Sierra Leone, for example. They're last in West Africa. They have a life expectancy rate of 40. That's astonishingly bad. That's like 1950 numbers. So we have parts of the world that it's kind of hard to sleep at night if you think about people that are in such poverty that when they're born they can only expect to live to be about 40 on average.